The evidence suggests that half of the things you believe to be true are simply wrong. Curious to know which half? You should be. Let's discuss. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. This weekend I had an article published on the Quillette website titled "The Environment is Too Important to be Left to Environmentalists." It's early days in terms of responses to that article, but one of the remarkable things was that it provoked the first highly charged reactions, and it was this opening paragraph. The fact that belief in climate change in the US tends to correlate with political affiliation should tell you that we are not objectively interpreting the science as much as we are following the values of our chosen peer group, because in a world where we follow the evidence, it's an extraordinarily unlikely outcome. That's a comment I've made before on at least one video here without it particularly attracting comment. Here it won the approval from the Dilbert cartoonist and Trump commentator Scott Adams, who tweeted it out and discussed it on his daily Periscope broadcast. But it turned out to be a red rag to a bull for certain readers who are very firmly embedded as advocates for one side or the other. And from the opposite sides of the fence, both of them said the same thing. This is completely wrong. It's not that we're following the values of our chosen peer group. It's that the other side have completely lost their minds. Or words to that effect. So let's look at this. First of all, the basic principle. If we want to change the world for the better as individual change makers, it's important that we see the world as it is, not as we'd like to pretend it to be. And that's for obvious reasons. If you're not seeing the world clearly, then how can you be sure that you're changing it for the better? History is littered with examples of people who did what they thought was the right thing, but found that they'd misread the situation and ended up making things worse. Now, that article was dealing specifically with climate change, but the principle applies to every issue under the sun that you might care about, and indeed your approach to life more generally. In climate change, you have one group that believes it's committed to the science, another that's persuaded itself that the science is fake, or at least that the problem is overblown because the agenda is being manipulated by people who want to achieve a certain outcome. It's my contention that neither of those is actually following the facts. It is about their peer group and what people like me believe. Now, as it happens, the science does correlate more closely with one side than the other, which you would kind of expect to be the case because it has to be somewhere. And no, it's probably not going to be exactly down the middle. So if you're on the Liberal Democratic side, you may say, well, our side is right because the science is on our side. But there's plenty of evidence that that's not why you believe in it. When the science doesn't fit the agenda, it's filtered out just as vigorously as it is by the people on the other side. Take, for instance, the so-called insect apocalypse that's now become one of the standard debating points on the left. The actual science does not support the contention that all insects will have died out in 100 years. The actual science does not prove that all insects have declined by a set amount in recent decades. The research that the headlines were based on was way too limited to prove those things, although it does give cause for concern. And the fact this has been pointed out by entomologists should mean that a movement that's following the science would restrict its rhetoric accordingly. But that information has been disregarded because it doesn't fit. Similarly, a lot of the rhetoric about how serious the impacts will be from climate change are put in extremely dramatic terms that are not representative of the actual evidence we have to date. But you only see that if you go back to the original research and read it for yourself, because the movement just grabs the headlines that it thinks will serve its propaganda cause the most effectively and runs with them. Oh, and even if your starting position does accord with the bulk of the evidence, it doesn't necessarily mean that your proposed solutions have any chance of working. If you haven't been rigorous in looking for data about what works and what doesn't in the real world, and your ideas are based on ideology, misperception, or wishful thinking, you may not be helping as much as you think. Now, since both sides do it, and in spite of what you may think about the people on the other side, the people on your side that do it aren't evil, so let's go with the idea for now that those on the other side aren't either. And there's just no point moralising about this. But it is in our interest to understand it, and to consider what we would have to do to make it less likely that we fall into the same trap. I'll say it now, I don't think any of us can avoid that entirely. We know too much about how the brain works and that we fool ourselves all the time. But we can surely at least hope to reduce the error percentage, and I'll talk about how you can do that at the end of this video. What evidence is there for the suggestion that our brains fool us? In his book, The Believing Brain, Michael Shermer presents some of the research evidence to suggest that our brains are always looking to find patterns in the data around us, and when it finds those patterns, to infuse them with meaning, intention, and agency. Once it's done that, the brain looks for and finds evidence that will confirm what it already believes. So it's not that we see evidence and then form our beliefs accordingly. Rather, we form our beliefs and then post-rationalize and justify those beliefs by picking out the evidence we find that fits the conclusion. And by the way, really smart people don't do this any differently. They just come up with better and more complex arguments after the event to justify their position. One of the most famous studies in psychology saw a group of normal, sane volunteers entering a dozen mental hospitals reporting having briefly heard voices. All of them were admitted and diagnosed, mostly as schizophrenic. The brief was, except to do with the brief hallucination they were to say that they'd had, they were otherwise to tell the truth about everything, behave normally, and say that the hallucinations had stopped and they felt fine. So these were sane people, and despite of all of that behaviour entirely in line with them being sane people, the psychiatrists were completely convinced they were ill, and they found evidence all over the place to justify that assumption. Perfectly normal answers to probing questions were taken as proving ongoing mental issues. The only people who spotted the fake straight away were some of the other patients who had no diagnosis to post-rationalise or defend. Now, that was just one experiment. There's a wealth of detail in the book about the different ways we fool ourselves, and I recommend it as reading for anyone who wants to understand their own tendencies better. You can add to that other ways that we tend to fool ourselves. We see people in our own groups as individuals, but we see people in other groups as homogenous. We judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge others by their actions. We have a negative bias to how we see the world because we're always surrounded by negative news, because that's what news organisations know that people find interesting, and it gives us a false perception about the balance of good and bad news in the world. So let's assume that you accept all that, and you accept that your tendencies are to fool yourself, and you want to minimise this so that you have a chance of seeing the world more clearly and being more effective at making a positive difference to it. So what can you do to improve the odds that you get it right? From my own experience, I'd suggest the following 5 things. 1. Always start from the working assumption that people in different groups to you are good, well-meaning people with whom you have lots in common. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have disagreements with how they see the world, but you can't just dismiss them all as being bad or being badly motivated. 2. Watch and listen to the best exponents of the positions that you actively disagree with, not just once, but often. Seek out the ones that are the most effective, that are clearly speaking with genuine commitment and passion. Sometimes they might change your mind, and even when they don't, you will at least start to empathise more with the people that hold those positions. 3. Whenever you see an assertion about the world in an area you care deeply about, check the original sources, especially when it's something that absolutely confirms your worldview, because it's those cases where you're most likely to believe something just because you want to. 4. Use your language carefully to say precisely what something is or isn't, and don't throw in lots of hyperbole. You'll quickly realise that other people are less careful about their language, but as you train yourself to be more careful, you'll find that it's much more useful in finding common ground with people when it makes sense to do so. And 5. Adopt the proper scientific mindset, which is to say that when you see a piece of information or an argument that challenges one of your existing beliefs, greet it with excitement. Study it carefully with the hope that it will give you something that will advance your knowledge and belief closer to the right direction. Good scientists are delighted when an existing theory is disproved because it moves them closer to the truth. The non-scientific method means that we establish our positions and then we defend them against all contrary evidence because we think that otherwise we might lose face or look foolish. Who cares about that? Well, you shouldn't. If you become good at all 5 of those things, will you become infallibly? Nope, absolutely not. But you will, first of all, improve the odds of getting it right because you'll be alive to the evidence. And second of all, you will also be more nuanced in discussion. People who are interested in other people's arguments are ironically much more influential than people who are closed and 100% certain of the factual and moral rightness of their position. Do you agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments below.